COVID-19 has resulted in economies shutting down across the world, and governments have been left scrambling to save the lives and the livelihoods of their citizens. Several governments have responded to the economic challenges presented by the pandemic through economic stimulus packages. But with trillions of dollars spent across the world, it leaves us wondering, where does the money for these programs come from? And if there are potentially any unintended consequences that may arise from this unusual spending activity. Today, I will be discussing government budgets, stimulus packages, and government debt. The fiscal budget is basically two parts. One part is the income, which comes from taxation, all kinds of taxes, sales, income tax. And on the other side is government spending that goes into maintaining the government itself, roads, infrastructure, health, education, and all other programs. But what happens when the planned spending by the government exceeds the expected income to be collected? In that case, the government runs a deficit. And there are several ways the government can fund this deficit, and we'll be looking at some of them here. The first way to address a deficit is for government to borrow. It can borrow from its international neighbors, it can borrow from businesses looking to invest in governments, and it can borrow from ordinary people. However, there's a limited pool of funds available to the government for borrowing. When the government borrows, it competes with ordinary people who are looking to borrow to buy a car or invest in a house, and it's competing with businesses looking to expand their businesses. As such, borrowing tends to increase the interest rates in the market, and it reduces the amount of funds available for businesses and individuals. But borrowing is only one of the ways. The other way for government to increase its funding is through raising taxes. However, there are also other setbacks associated with raising taxes. Again, there's a limited pool of the taxable base, and increasing taxes reduces the standards of living, because if a larger portion of income is going towards paying tax, there's less that can be spent on increasing the welfare of your citizens. And also, higher taxes could encourage corporations to relocate their operations to a base where they pay less taxes and thus are more profitable. The final method the government can use to cover a deficit is through just printing money. But the obvious side effect of printing money is the increased risk of hyperinflation. Now, hyperinflation is a serious problem, and it leads to less productivity in the economy, lowers the standards of living, and lowers investment rates, because there's no point in investing if your returns are going to be much less than the money you carry now. And once again, businesses that find themselves in a hyperinflation environment tend to relocate elsewhere. So all three of these ways to address a budget deficit have negative consequences for the wider economy and for the government itself. And yet, for the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen governments primarily resort to the third method of raising money. And this is for a good reason. So with the first approach, government borrowing reduces the amount of funds available to businesses and individuals. As an investor, would you rather invest in a government which you know can just print money to pay you back? Or would you rather invest in a business that might fold or individuals that might default? Because the government is more reliable than individuals and corporations, if it enters into the debt market, it will reduce the availability of funds for the rest of the economy, thus stifling economic growth, in addition to increasing interest rates. because increasing interest rates discourages borrowing and spending, and thus further exacerbates the recession. With the second approach, raising taxes is not even popular during prosperous years, let alone when there's a recession. It is like encouraging a nation to raise itself by pulling on its bootstraps. So, governments have resorted to the third approach. And this is in order to prevent raising the interest rates and reducing the spending power of its citizens. But as mentioned, while the government can print money, there is a risk of hyperinflation. And the trick is to balance between stimulating the economy and providing enough money for individuals to start spending again and avoid a recession, but not to increase the money supply so much that money loses its value and starts a cycle of hyperinflation. So in a nutshell, this is where money for stimulus packages comes from, but it is further worth investigating into its longer-term impact on interest rates and on inflation.